The hills above Ash Hollow always looked half asleep at dawn. Low-backed and blue in the early light, they crouched along the edge of the basin like tired animals, ribs hidden under scrub and stone. The town lay below them in a shallow bowl of dust and cottonwoods, small and temporary, as if someone had set it there to see how long it would last before the country remembered itself and wiped the slate clean. On some mornings the wind came down soft and dry, carrying the smell of sage and old rain that never quite reached the ground. On other mornings it carried something else, an iron taste, a hint of sulfur. The faintest tremor under boot Saul's man could almost blame on his own pulse. That summer, the hills were not asleep at all. They were listening. If this kind of quiet, cinematic Western pulls you in, now is a good time to subscribe, like the video, and tell where you're watching from in the comments. It helps us keep riding back into these lonely places and bringing the stories out alive. Long before anyone in Ash Hollow took notice, a woman had stood in the heat-struck street, eyes lifted toward the ridges, and said there was something in those hills that did not belong. She had felt it in the way the wash behind the boarding house stayed dry when it should have run, in the way the chickens went silent without reason, in the way the mine timbers gave off occasional sharp, complaining pops even on still days. No one had listened, or rather, they had listened just enough to laugh, to shrug, to say the hills had always creaked and settled, the way old bones did before storm. Then they had gone back to their ledgers and their whiskey and their cards, telling themselves that the earth held no secrets that could not be stacked, measured, and sold by the ton. Elias Ward had listened a little more than most. He rode the line between Ash Hollow and the hills the way a man rides the edge of his own life, carefully, out of habit, with more attention than he ever admitted. He was in his late 30s, but wore the desert older. A cavalry bullet from another war had gone into his hip and lodged near the bone, turning his right leg into a stiff, reluctant thing that never quite forgave him for the miles he asked of it. His hearing was not what it had been, either. On cold nights in the bunkhouse, the ghost of cannon still rolled across his skull, distant thunder from fields he no longer saw. But his eyes were good, and his conscience, though scarred, still woke early. Each morning he rode up from town before the sun fully cleared the eastern rim, following the narrow track that climbed past the last cottonwoods into rock and juniper. Below him, Ash Hollow stretched small and neat, a row of false front buildings, a scatter of roofs, the bright thread of creek that limped through cottonwood shade before losing heart in the sand. Above, the hills gathered themselves into long shoulders and broken spines, shadow pooled deep in their folds. Elias had not always belonged in such silence. There had been a time when his days were filled with marching orders and shouted names, when the horizon was something to charge rather than to watch. That time had ended in smoke and screaming, in a canyon back east where civilians had been caught between fear and command, and his own hesitation had dragged the moment out just long enough for the worst to happen. Since then, he had come west and narrowed his life to smaller tasks, counting cattle against a ledger, riding the fence, patching the brakes, making sure the roofs of Ash Hollow stayed where they had been nailed. He avoided crowds, preferred the talk of leather and wind to the noise of men. He had decided, without saying it, that his share of big choices was spent. The woman who watched the hills, Mara Ellis, had not made that decision yet. She ran the boarding house on the north edge of town, where the dust from a mine road settled into every crack and the sound of wagon wheels never quite let go. Her hair was tied back in practical knots, skin-tanned and lined by years of carrying water and lifting mattresses and scrubbing other people's boots. She had lost a husband to the hills, claimed by a cave-in 2 winters back when the Barley Crown mine pushed its tunnels deeper than prudence and timbers both allowed. Since then she watched the ridgeline the way a widow watches a door that never opens again. Elias noticed it first in the way his horse moved. The bay had been sure-footed since the day Elias bought him off a freighter with more debts than sense. The gelding knew rock from sand, shale from clay. But on 3 mornings in a row, as they neared the switchback that overlooked the Barley Crown's entrance, The horse balked for no clear reason. Ears pricked, head high, nostrils flaring at a scent Elias could not name. Each time, after a moment's trembling pause, the gelding advanced, but the hesitation lodged under Elias's ribs like a splinter. Later, he stared down into the valley where the mine camp sprawled. Shacks and wagons, a coal-black dump of tailings, the yawning mouth of the main shaft dark as a missing tooth. Men moved ant-like between buildings. Smoke rose in tired threads. From this height, nothing looked unusual. Yet he felt it. The same wrong note in the air that Mara had tried to describe when he'd passed her porch at dusk and seen her gripping the rail, eyes on the ridge rather than the street. She had not spoken to him in words he could quote, but he had read the warning in the set of her shoulders, in the way her gaze tracked a small rockfall sliding down a far slope long after the dust had settled. That week, the hills began to speak more plainly. A seam of coal near the surface caught fire. A slow burn, hidden, fed by dry roots and abandoned timbers. Smoke seeped from ground that had no business smoking. The Barley Crown's foreman tamped the vents and told the men it was nothing. The company had contracts to fill, schedules to keep. The ore carts kept rolling. The ledger licked its finger and turned another page. At night, Elias lay awake in the bunkhouse and felt a faint, rhythmic tremor under his mattress, like a dull drumbeat too far off to fully hear. The mice stopped running in the walls. Out in the corrals, horses shifted and blew at shadows. The creek behind town, low from drought, began to run stranger, thin, sour, carrying a faint taste of something metallic. On the seventh day, clouds rolled in from the west, boiling up over the hills in bruised, towering columns. Thunderheads built along the horizon, white and black stacked like judgment. Lightning sheeted behind them, too far off to hear, but close enough to flash pale light across the rock. Every gullied hillside in the territory leaned forward a fraction, waiting for the first hard rain. The mine boss pushed the day's shift longer. If the storm broke, the tunnels would flood. Better to pull as much or as possible before the ground turned to muck. Lanterns bobbed underground long past noon. The hoist wheel creaked and spun, hauling cars up and down. Men coughed black and cursed and laughed in the way men do when they think danger is an old joke that has forgotten the punchline. Elias rode the ridge that afternoon with an unease that had settled into his bones. The bullet scar in his hip woke in a way it had not in years, throbbing in time with something deeper, something under the earth itself. He felt it when his horse crossed a certain seam of rock, a faint, hollow give, as if the ground were less solid than it appeared. Below, Ash Hollow went about its business. Children chased one another around the church. A wagon loaded with flour jolted into town. At the boarding house, Mara hung damp sheets on the line, though the air said clearly that rain would make a liar of her labor. The first thunder sounded like a distant cannon. Elias flinched before he could stop himself, hand twitching toward a gun that was not there. The next rumble rolled longer, closer. He watched the storm line lean in over the hills, watched the first gray veil of rain begin to drag from cloud to rock. The smell came up the wind a heartbeat later, not just wet dust, but something sharper. Sulfur and smoke, coal and splintered pine. The hills answered the thunder with a sound of their own, a low grinding crack, like a door being forced open after years of rust. The Barley Crown was built over a maze of tunnels, some mapped, some not. Fire traveled down old shafts, found pockets of gas left by careless blasting, gnawed at the supports that held the hill's weight off the heads of men. When the rain hit cold and sudden, it sent steam and trapped air lunging for freedom. The hill exhaled. To the men at the hoist, it started as a shudder through the timbers. Tools rattled on hooks. Lantern flames jumped. Then the main shaft breathed out a mixture of smoke and dust so thick and fast it shoved men backward. A second later, a deeper roar rolled up from under their feet, and the entrance sagged like dough in an oven. The hillside above the mine mouth buckled. A seam split wide, vomiting rock and earth and shattered timber. The first hut in its path vanished, as if someone had wiped it from a slate. Men ran, stumbled, clawed free. The mine boss shouted orders nobody heard. Lightning struck somewhere on the ridge, white and furious. From his vantage, Elias saw it all at once. The collapse, the slide, the way the torn hill was gathering itself into an oncoming wave of mud and stone that would not stop at the camp. The channel it was choosing pointed like a finger toward the creek, and from there, straight down the draw toward town. He kicked his horse toward the switchback before thinking, before weighing odds or options. Pain flared through his leg, but the bay launched forward, slipping and catching on the wet rock. The first fat drops of rain hit his face like thrown gravel. Below, the rush of earth gained speed, a dirty, grinding river obeying gravity and hunger alone. No scene in a life like his ever sat still. As he drove the bay down the track, Elias's mind measured distances the way a seasoned scout learns to do, without numbers. The slide would hit the creek in minutes. The sudden dam would send water and mud spilling sideways, out across the hollow where the children played and the poorest shacks leaned close to the bank. There was no way to stop the hill, but there might still be time to move the people. He reached town in a spray of mud and lather, horse blown, lungs burning. The storm hit Ash Hollow full just as he clattered into the main street. Rain came down in sheets, turning dust to slick glue, drumming on roofs and shoulders and hats. The creek, moments ago a trickle, swollen at once, snarling against its banks. Elias did not waste breaths on explanations. His life had been spent in fields where seconds meant survival. The habit of moving first and thinking later had sunk deeper than regret. He drove the horse straight toward the lower end of town, the part nearest the water, where the boarding house stood and the wash curled behind the cabins like a lazy scar. Mara was already in the yard when he came, hair plastered to her face, eyes on the hills. She had felt the first tremor as the slide hit the creek. The earth under her feet had given a brief, sickening lurch before settling into a new, wrong angle. The cottonwoods along the bank shivered as water slammed into them from upstream. A brown wall topped with debris, branches, boards, the broken ghosts of things that once had edges. In the narrow moments that followed, action belonged to anyone who was willing to move. Elias flung himself from his saddle, leg nearly giving, and began to haul people to higher ground. Children first, then the old, then those too stubborn or stunned to understand. He pushed shoulders, pointed with his whole body, herded them up the rise toward the church, which sat on the town's one decent knoll. Mara waded into the flood of bodies with the same fierce efficiency she had used for years on linens and ledgers. She tore hands from doorframes, dragged trunks away from people who thought they could save their possessions, scooped up a toddler from the mud just as a surge of water ate the yard where the child had been standing. The creek left its banks with a sound like a building exhaling. Water and mud rushed into the hollow streets, curling around cabins, lifting steps from foundations. The lowest houses groaned, shifted, folded. A chicken coop spun once in the torrent and vanished. The boarding house shuddered as the wash behind it filled, mud slapping against its back wall in angry, rising blows. Through it, Elias moved like a man paying off a debt. His bad leg screamed each time he lunged through the mud, but he did not let it dictate the distance. He carried a boy on his shoulders, then an old man who had not known he could still wrap his arms around another human being. He lifted a crate so a woman could haul herself onto it and scramble to the church steps. He shoved open a stuck door and found, inside, a girl who had frozen at the sight of water rising under her window. He led her out with a hand on her back, not looking at her face, knowing that if he saw her eyes he might think of another girl in another doorway with blood on her dress and a bullet in her chest. By the time the main pulse of the water tore through town, the church knoll was crowded with wet, shaking bodies. Children clung to parents. Men who had scoffed at the notion of danger in the hills stared in stunned silence as the lower part of Ash Hollow drowned in a brown, churning lake. Lightning forked over the ruptured hillside. Thunder rolled. The mine camp was a smear of destruction where the slide had come through. Tents flattened, shacks splintered, the shaft entrance gone. Some men had run fast enough. Others had not. The tally of the lost would take days, maybe weeks, and some names would never be spoken over a grave, because there would be no grave to speak over. When the storm eased and the rain became a tired drizzle, Ash Hollow took stock. The lower row of houses was ruined. The boarding house's back rooms had caved, their walls torn open, beds and tables, and the private order of lives spilled into the mud. The church still stood, white paint streaked with brown. The hill above the barley crown bore a fresh, raw wound, a wide, pale scar where rock and earth had given way. Elias stood in the leaking vestibule of the church, clothes plastered to him, mud drying on his hands like a second skin. The pain in his hip felt like fire and ice welded together, but beneath it something else lived, a strange, fragile quiet where, for the first time in years, the old battlefield thunder in his skull was not the loudest thing. Around him, people hugged those they had feared lost. Some wept. Some stared. Some, later, would tell the story in a way that made them braver than they felt. In all those tellings, one fact would remain. When the hills finally spoke the truth of what was inside them, it had been the woman who watched them and the man who carried his guilt like an extra bone who moved fastest. Her warnings, once dismissed, would become part of the town's private scripture. His ride, once unthinkable to a man who had sworn off big choices, would become a turning in his own life he would never speak of but always feel. Mara would rebuild what she could of the boarding house, piecing rooms back together from scavenged boards and stubbornness. She would keep watching the hills, but now others would glance up with her when thunder piled on the ridge, and men would think twice before driving shafts deeper without listening to the ground. Elias would continue to ride the line, legs stiff, coat worn, eyes on the horizon. The world outside would not know his name. No newspaper would print what he had done. But on certain evenings, when the sun slid behind the raw scar in the hillside and turned to copper, he would feel the weight on his shoulders lessen by the smallest degree, as if some of what he had failed to do in that far eastern canyon had been balanced, a little, by what he had managed here. The hills would heal slowly. Grass would creep back over the slide in stubborn patches. Cottonwoods would send new shoots from drowned roots. The creek would find a new course, carving its own redemptive line through the basin. And somewhere in the long record the land kept under its stony ribs, the story would lie like a narrow vein of ore, a warning unheeded until the earth made itself impossible to ignore, a day when water and rock came down together, and a wounded man moved toward the danger instead of away, revealing, in the quiet violence of his choice, the better part of what still lived in him.